My wife and I are huge moviegoers. Well, we used to be huge moviegoers, and then these little people showed up in our home, and children, and so we're not as frequent moviegoers as we used to be. But we do enjoy going to the movies when we're able to. And tonight is the 89th Academy Awards. And so millions of movie lovers and moviegoers will gather in homes to watch Hollywood's biggest night. Directors, producers, actors will sit inside Dolby Theatre, hoping to hear the famous words, and the Oscar goes to, and receive that trophy, Hollywood's most coveted trophy, the Oscar. You know, 60 years ago, in 1957, there was a movie that won an Oscar for Best Visual Effect. And it was The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. And for those who don't know, this movie is a portrayal of the Exodus story of God delivering his people out of Egypt. And in this epic scene, in this epic movie, we find that God has brought his people out of Egypt. And Moses, the leader of God's people, is on the edge of the Red Sea, with the Red Sea in front of him. And behind him is the most powerful man in the world at the time, Pharaoh, and the most powerful army at the time in the world. And so they're stuck, and it's an epic scene. Let's watch it.
The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand. God opens the sea with the blast of his nostrils.
Considered the most difficult special effect ever performed up to that moment, this scene, this epic scene, illustrates a scriptural truth, and it's this: regardless of the trouble behind you and regardless of the trouble in front of you, there is a God who is for you. And today we're going to look at the story of the Exodus. So before we do that, would you please take a moment to pray with me? Our great God and loving Father, thank you that we get to be here this morning together as a body to worship you in song and to hear from your teaching. And God, we ask this morning that you would call people to yourself, that you would send some of us out, and that God, you would deliver some this morning that need to be delivered. And we ask all this in Jesus' great name. Amen. Exodus chapter 1. We're going to begin at verse 1 and read a few verses. So I want to encourage you to follow along with me. Again, Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, it reads, "Now these are the names of the son of Israel who came out to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, and Gad, and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation." Now, these verses serve as a link between the book of Exodus and Genesis. They're verses that remind us of what has just happened in order to set up what's about to happen. And so last week, Pastor Sherm talked about how Jacob, or Israel, had 12 sons, and how 11 of the sons hated one of the sons, Joseph. And they were so jealous of him, and they hated him so deeply, they sold him to slavery. And Joseph, as Pastor Sherm helped us understand last week, Joseph finds himself in Egypt. And God does what he does. And God takes Joseph and puts him second in command in Egypt, just under Pharaoh. And then we read in Genesis about a great famine that spread across the land. And Egypt had grain. And so Joseph's 11 brothers make their way down to Egypt. They don't realize it, but they're standing in front of their brother, who ends up loving them and serving them and helping them. And the sons stay with Joseph in Egypt. And then the book of Genesis ends with Joseph on his deathbed. And Joseph is on his deathbed and he's surrounded by his brothers. And he reminds his brothers of a promise that God made to Abraham several years prior. And it was the promise that God was going to deliver his people out of this foreign land, Egypt, and take them to their own land. But in this promise that God gave Abraham, God said that the descendants of Joseph and his brothers would be oppressed and enslaved for 400 years. And this sets the context for the book of Exodus. And then in Exodus, we find that there's a new king, there's a new Pharaoh who does not know Joseph and what Joseph had done. And this king realizes that the Israelites are growing and growing and growing. Roughly 200 million Hebrews in Egypt at this time. And so this king, this Pharaoh, was threatened by them. And so his plan was this, we read at the end of Exodus chapter 1. He gave the command to throw all the newborn baby boys into the Nile River. And chapter 1 ends with that. But then in chapter 2, we learn of the birth of Moses. And when Moses was 3 months old, his Hebrew parents made a basket and they put it in the edge of the Nile. And God does what he does. The basket makes its way down the river, and there just next to the river is Pharaoh's daughter. She sees the baby. She, the scriptures tell us, draws Moses out of the water. And next we find out that Moses' sister has been watching the whole time. And she says to Pharaoh's daughter, would you like me to run and find a Hebrew mother who could take care of this Hebrew baby? And Pharaoh's daughter says yes. And so in God's sovereignty, he brings Moses and his mother back together. And so here we see the sovereignty of God working in Moses' life, just as we saw the sovereignty of God working in Joseph's life. And one of the things I think we can learn from the story of Moses is that if you find yourself in the Nile, remind yourself of the one who controls the Nile. We find that Moses grows up, and in chapter 2, verse 11, it reads this. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, and so Moses is roughly 40 years old, that he went out to his brethren. And so we see here that Moses was kind of torn. He lived in Egypt, in Pharaoh's household, but he believed and he knew his people were the Hebrews. So he says he saw his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Moses looked this way and that. And when he saw when there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. See, in this moment, Moses determines his allegiance is with God's people. The very next day, Moses goes out and he sees two Hebrews fighting. And Moses tries to step in and be the deliverer. And they say to Moses, "Who are you to judge us? We know you killed the Egyptian," they said to Moses. And Moses became afraid because of what he had done to the Egyptian had become known. And then Pharaoh finds out and is on a mission to kill Moses. And so abandoned by his own people and sought after Pharaoh, Moses, we read in Exodus, flees to the desert. And in the desert, he marries, and he becomes a shepherd of his father-in-law's flock. And then Moses experiences arguably the turning point of his life. In Exodus chapter 3, we read that Moses saw a marvelous sight. A marvelous sight, and it was this bush that was burning but was not consumed. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 4 reads this: When the Lord saw that Moses turned aside to look, God called to him from amidst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Has there been a time in your life when God has called out to you? Has there been a time in your life when God has spoken your name and has called out to you? Over the last several weeks, some of us as a staff, we've been getting together and we've been listening to each other's called out story, how God has called them out, how God has saved them. And it's been great to hear one of the men on our staff tell how he was bullied and in depression, but God called him out of that and saved him. And how one lady's on our staff, how she has just sensed that God has called her most of her life. So has God called out to you, and have you responded like Moses? Here I am. And parents, can I challenge you? Grandparents, can I challenge you? Do your children and your grandchildren know your called out story? Do they know how God has rescued you and delivered you? And after God calls out Moses, God begins to share with Moses just how holy and great he is. Then in verse 10 of chapter 3, God says this: Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. And so here is Moses' mission. You are to go to the most powerful man on the planet at that time, and you are to take my people and deliver them out of Egypt. What a mission. And can I just tell you, here in the Old Testament is an example of how the Old Testament points to the New Testament. See, there is a greater Moses, and his name is Jesus. And just as God sent Moses to deliver God's people from the hand of Pharaoh, God, the scriptures tell us, sent his one and only Son to deliver you from sin and death. And there's a greater Moses. And do you know him? Do you know Jesus? Moses doubts God, and Moses questions God. I'm not good enough. I can't speak. Who's going to listen to me? He argues with God and questions God. And God says to Moses, we read, I will be with you. And God gives to Moses his personal name, I am. And God also gives to Moses the ability to perform signs to show Pharaoh who God is. And so then in Exodus chapter 4 through Exodus chapter 14, you have this battle between God's mighty hand and Pharaoh's hardened heart. And so the story of the Exodus, in the middle of it is this battle, this conflict with God flexing his power and his glory, saying to Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh with a hardened heart says, no, 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 no. And over, God gives Pharaoh an opportunity. But Pharaoh continues to harden his heart, and God allows that to happen. And so God sends these 10 plagues, and the last plague is death. And this plague is going to come through the land and take the firstborn of every household and the firstborn of every livestock. But God says to Moses, have the Hebrews take a lamb an unblemished lamb, a spotless lamb, and to sacrifice that lamb and to place the blood above the door frame of your doors. And when death comes, it will pass over. And we read this in Exodus chapter 12, verse 13. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And again, here we have the Old Testament pointing us to Jesus. In the New Testament, in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18, it reads, knowing that you are not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile way of life inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood as of a lamb unblemished. Does that sound familiar with the Exodus story? And spotless, the blood of Christ. And so just as Christ is the ultimate Moses, Christ is the ultimate lamb to take away the sins of the world. And so on that night, death came knocking. Death touched the household of Pharaoh and all the other houses of Egypt. But God's people were saved because of the Passover lamb. And so Pharaoh says to Moses, go, and while you go, will you bless me? And so Moses and approximately 2 million Israelites leave Egypt for good. And they set out. But we read that Pharaoh has a change of heart. Pharaoh realizes he's lost his workforce. He's lost those who were going to build up his kingdom. And so the scriptures tell us that he gets his 600 select chariots, the best chariots that he possibly has. 600 of those and all the other chariots, and they set their face toward Moses and they go after the Hebrews. And so you have this scene. You have this scene of Moses and the Hebrew people on the edge of the Red Sea. The Red Sea in front of them, and they hear the chariots, they hear the horses coming from behind them, and often as the Hebrew people do, they begin to complain and gripe to Moses. Has God brought us out here to kill us? Why didn't he just leave us in Egypt to die? Are there not enough graves in Egypt, so we're just going to bury us here? And then Exodus chapter 14, verse 13. But Moses said to the people, do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians who you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Just stand and watch. Just stand and be silent. Several years ago, we bought for our kids, we bought this kitchen set. And it came in a very small box. And my wife had this grand idea to, hey, while the kids are asleep, let's build it. And I said, okay. So the kids went to sleep and we opened this and parts kept coming out and tools kept coming out and we needed to get other tools. And then in our living room set this incredible kitchen that we spent half the night putting together. We finally got it put together and we set it up in the living room. And our kids, all they do is wake up, open their eyes, and there it is for them. They didn't turn a screw. They didn't lift a hammer. They did not do anything but sleep. And we accomplished that for them. And this is what Jesus has done for you in a much grander scale. In 2 Corinthians 5:21, it says, God made Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for you and for me, so that we might become the righteousness of God. See, all we were doing is sleeping, and God saved us. Be still, be silent, and see the salvation of the Lord. Verse 30 of chapter 14 reads, "Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore." Wow. What a great story of God's love and God's justice. And we read how the Hebrews respond on the shore there in verse 31. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. After seeing the mighty hand of God, the people trusted in him. Have you trusted in God? Have you seen what he's done for you and you trusted in him? Like Moses, can you say to the call of God, "Here I am"? Like the call to be sent to go somewhere, will you say, "I trust you, here I am"? On that day, the people trusted in the Lord. And our hope for you this morning is that if you don't trust in our God, would you trust in him this morning? And then I love what happened next. It says that after they trusted in God, the next chapter in Exodus 15 says they worshiped God. Right there in the moment, in view of God's power, they worshiped him. They had witnessed a miracle. They had witnessed God deliver them through the Red Sea, and they worshiped. What is your Red Sea? Maybe God brought you through cancer. Maybe God brought you through the death of a loved one. Maybe God brought you through a financial crisis. What is your Red Sea where you can look back and see the mighty hand of God and in return worship him? So in light of your Red Sea experience, I want to invite us now in this moment to worship. And I want to invite us to worship by reading the Song of Moses in Exodus 15. And so we're going to read the Song of Moses, and I want to invite you, when it gets to the scriptures that are in blue, I want to invite you to read those out loud with me. And I want to hear you. The band's going to be playing some music, so I want to hear you. When you see the blue scriptures, I want you to worship and read with me out loud. Exodus chapter 15. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My Father's God, and I will extol him. The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea, and the choicest of his officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deeps cover them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, is majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. And in the greatness of your excellence, you overthrow those who rise up against you. You send forth your burning anger, and it consumes them as chaff. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters were piled up. The flowing waters stood up like a heap. The deeps were congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be gratified against them. I will draw out my sword, my hand will destroy them. And you blew with your wind, the sea covered them, they sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders. You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your loving kindness, you have led the people whom you have redeemed. In your strength, you have guided them to your holy habitation. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Anguish has gripped the inhabitants of Philistine. The chiefs of Edom were dismayed. The leaders of Moab, trembling, grips them. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm, they are motionless as stone until your people pass over, O Lord. Until the people pass over whom you have purchased. You will bring them and plant them in your mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord shall reign forever and ever.